it is a great honour and pleasure to introduce Professor Steve Hopper. He's Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Western Australia Albany Centre. So it's really great to have a speaker from out west, really, because in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, we tend to be very Eastern-centric, and it's excellent to welcome you, Steve. So over more than 50 years, Steve's worked in conservation biology, helping to shape our understanding of biodiversity in ancient landscapes and how people live sustainably with those. He's served as Director of Kings Park and Botanic Garden in Perth, which we all love, and later as CEO and Chief Scientist at London's Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. An enormous honour, the first non-British person to fill that role. He's worked on 2 major international botanic gardens, so we're dealing here with a real rock star. So Steve has authored more than 300 papers and several books, including Eucalyptus, Soul of the Desert, and Life on the Rocks. See, told you he was a rock star. Steve today brings us a perspective from OCBILs, the old climatically buffered infertile landscapes that hold extraordinary biodiversity across half the world's hotspots, including Australia's southwests and areas in the Eastern Australia. Look, I will now share my screen so that we can move to welcoming Steve to make his presentation.
Terrific, Jane. Thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you and members of the association. I gave a fair bit of thought to this topic as it was sort of introduced to me, particularly the concept of mesic shift, and I'll make a few comments about that shortly. But I wanted to just take you back a little way. I was Western Australia's first flora conservation research scientist, and I had the task in the 1980s of developing an understanding of threatened plants across the state of Western Australia. Because a lot of the putatively rare plants, based on herbarium specimens, turned out not so. That just the collections were deficient. The only way to really find out whether something was localised and rare and under threat was to put in the hard yards in the field. And we managed to do that through the 1980s and come up with a couple of 100 species that we were confident were both rare and localised and also under threat. And in summarising what was known about them, we published a little rather obscure book these days in 1990, but in it we summarised the habitats occupied by these 200 plus species and found that fully 2/3 of them were confined to the little bumps in the landscape that we have in southwestern Australia. So we don't have mountains the size of the Great Dividing Range, but we do have granite outcrops that will stick up 100 metres above the surrounding plain, and things like lateritic mesas, very similar to what Mark was talking about at Gringai. So they're lateritic flat top hills, and a range of other smaller eminences like that. The Stirling Range in the Fitzgerald River National Park, if viewers have been to those places, they'll know what I'm talking about. And fully 2/3 of the genuinely rare and threatened plants were confined and endemic to these local bumps. If you go down lower in the landscape, just drop down often 50 metres, 100 metres maybe, to the margins of rivers and lakes or along the beach, then only 10-11% of the threatened species in the southwest are found there, and in between about a quarter in the transitional country. Next slide. So after thinking about this for 30 or 40 years, I had an opportunity after I left Kings Park. I was recruited by UWA for a couple of years in 2004 to 2006, and I wanted to develop a a theoretical framework that I could direct students towards challenging and testing. And the long of it short of it was that it became clear to me that if you're going to explain the high endemism of the southwest flora, and particularly of the threatened species, then there seemed to be not a single explanatory factor, but three operating together. One was age of landscape, and by age I mean lands that were above sea level at the point in the evolution of the Earth when sea level was highest, 90 million years ago. The blue insert in the middle bottom row, shows you landscapes at that time. And the really interesting thing is you'll notice the southern hemisphere is more or less recognisable, which means that coastlines were more or less where they are today, except for perhaps India and Madagascar. You know, India had to do a right angle bend after ripping away from Antarctica and Southwest Australia, and then going north to push up the Himalayas. But look at the northern hemisphere. It's scarcely recognisable in terms of coastlines. So this is a fundamental difference between north and south that has had profound impact on the way people think about landscapes, and really, I think, calls for a major rethink of southern hemisphere landscapes. Most people live in the northern hemisphere these days. Most biologists live there. Most restoration ecologists live there. And yet the vast majority of land in the northern hemisphere was under ice just 12,000 to 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum. In the southern hemisphere, glaciers were very few and far between, up and down the Andes, of course. But think of Australia, the glacial fields would have been a little bit bigger than they are today, but not much. And Southwest Australia hasn't had a glacier on it for 250 million years, not 12,000 to 18,000. And that you really need to think about. So what happens if the opportunity for continuous terrestrial existence goes back that far in time? And the Ocbill theory is one attempt to try and devise testable ideas about what happens. The second attribute is this one of reduced disturbance levels. Climatic buffering, I call it, because climate is the major disturbance that plants and terrestrial animals face. Climatically buffered areas are usually those that are adjacent to oceans. So notice again that in the southern hemisphere, the coastlines were more or less the same as now, and therefore an oceanically modified climate for up to 500 kilometres inland of the coast would have prevailed in the southern hemisphere. Not so much in the northern hemisphere. Some of the coastlines are a little recognisable, but hardly any. And the third interacting attribute that seems to be of profound importance under the regime of old landscapes that are climatically buffered is that they're infertile. So basically, rainfall falling for 250 million years on land washes all the nutrients out of the uplands, down the riverlines, and ultimately into the ocean. So that's the third aspect of this. And I tested and developed the theory with Southwestern Australia in mind, but also looking at the Greater Cape Floristic Region in Africa and the Pantapui sandstone uplands in equatorial South America. So these ideas aren't uniquely Australian, but they came out of Southwest Australia. Next slide. So here's a cartoon in the middle showing you the difference between what I call Ocbill's, old climatically buffered infertile landscapes, and the antithesis, which is Yodful. So they're young, often disturbed, fertile landscapes. So notice the Ocbill's are the green bars in the cartoon. So it's lateritic ironstone or sandstone hilltops. It can be wetland, fresh or salt lake. It can be a sand plain, and it can be granite outcrops. The younger landscapes are the steep erosional slopes immediately adjacent to the old landscapes, and right over on the left-hand side, all the country that's adjacent to the oceans or rivers or lakes. And these photos just illustrate how you recognise these things. So the top photo is lateritic mesa country inland from Geraldton in southwest Australia, flat-topped hills, which are OCBILs on top, and then the breakaway slopes, we call them, where the erosional edges are young landscapes, as are the river valleys. If you go down to the bottom, close to where I live on the left, is a peninsula separating King George Sound from Princess Royal Harbour in Albany, and there's a granite outcrop in the foreground, and then the country just drops down 20, 30 metres onto an isthmus that's only 7,000 years old. It's got a freshwater wetland in it, and it's got fundamentally different vegetation to what's immediately on the granite outcrop. And then you go further out and you run into more granite country, and you're back into old landscapes again. And in mountain ranges, on the right-hand side, the Stirling range, the OCBILs are the highest points because that's the most resistant rock to erosion. But also they do erode and form foothills. And often, if the foothills are flat, then they can form old landscapes as well. And the young landscapes, again, are the steep erosional slopes. Now, up top left, just to illustrate the international application of this idea, there's Table Mountain in Cape Town, South Africa. That's the classic OCBIL flat top hill on top, and then steep erosional young landscapes surrounding it. And Mark just showed us the Ku-ring-gai Chase old landscapes. So I think they're a perfect match for this sort of thing. Next slide. So just to reinforce that we're dealing with a global phenomenon here, not a uniquely Australian one, the red circles here are around global biodiversity hotspots, places that are richest on Earth in endemic species of plants and birds that are under threat. And you can see that about half the recognised global biodiversity hotspots, including in Australia, the Southwest, but also the forests of East Australia, have what has been published in the literature now, have OCBILs among the landscapes to be seen. Next slide. And here's the body of hypotheses. I don't expect you to absorb all of these, but there's a series of 12 ecological, evolutionary and cultural hypotheses, beginning with reduced dispersibility on OCBILs. And there's a series of conservation management hypotheses, which are in the grey bars. Each of these I've published in a form that can be tested, and over the last, this was first published in 2009, and the list of hypotheses you see here in 2023, which has now completed the development of the theory, I believe, and each is testable. So I've had PhD students and colleagues around the world working on it, various aspects of this. Next slide. And I'll just give you one example of how, if you start thinking about this older landscape idea, things turn on their head in terms of conventional theory in conservation genetics, in restoration ecology. So we have a banksia called the river banksia in southwest Australia, Banksia semi-nuda, grows to be quite a high tree relatively for WA, right on the alluvial flats in young landscapes, yodfils. And it's shown in orange in these diagrams. But down near Walpole on the south coast, there's a little 30-kilometre strip of isolated granite hilltops that just stick up a little bit above surrounding terrain and reach as far as about 5 kilometres inland. On those, you find a shrubby form of semi-nuda, and they really hug the granite outcrops themselves. I named that subspecies remanens. Now, if you look at conventional population genetics, there's a thing that if you've got a widespread species, you expect genetic diversity to change over space. You get into isolation by distance hypotheses, the idea. So at the extremes, you would expect the extreme genetic differences in the species. If, however, you live in small populations that are close together, like at Walpole, just 30 kilometres apart, the prediction is they're all inbred and they should be genetically not that different. So we looked at DNA sequencing in this system, and if you look at the top diagram, it shows genetic space. And instead of the orange circle spanning the full 400 kilometre range of semi-neuter being the largest, it's the smallest. And the real genetic diversity is in those hilltop granite outcrop populations spread over just 30 kilometres on the south coast that constitute subspecies remnants. Completely converse of what conventionally population genetics would predict. And to me, that's interesting and exciting. It's hard to publish, lots of scepticism, but you know, to me, it makes a hell of a lot of sense as soon as you understand the difference between the old and young landscapes. Next slide. Now, the exciting thing to me, over the last 40 years, I've worked with Noongar Aboriginal people, but intensively over the last 15. And this lady is one of the two families on the south coast of Western Australia that have continuous oral history. She escaped stolen generation. She contracted childhood meningitis when she was stolen, lasted a week in a mission, and then 4 months in hospital, and was lucky to survive, after which her father told the mission, "No way you're taking my daughter again. I'm going to teach her in my traditional culture and bring her up." So she camped with her father and his extended family and her grandparents. And she was worried that her kids at the time I met her, which was 12 years ago, weren't that interested in recording the cultural knowledge that she'd acquired. And after 2 or 3 years, we agreed to do an oral history together. That's now happened. I've been out on country with her to something like 500 different places along the south coast, across the full range of her traditional land. And the learning experience for me has been profound. I've had to do a number of things. Number one is learn to shut up and listen, which is probably the most important thing. You know, in white conversations, if there's a pregnant pause, then people fill it. I think it's a deficiency in a conversation. Complete converse with Aboriginal people. They're often thinking about the topic you're talking about, and you may have come to a question and they may be trying to devise a way of answering it in a way that doesn't offend you, but doesn't offend cultural priorities either. So that was really important. And the long and short of it is, the second conversation Lynette and I had, I just said, "Can you tell me about how you care for country?" And she said, "You just need to understand 2 words in our language, cart and bilia." So cart is their term for the human head, but also for hilltops. So they believe similar things happen in the human head and hilltops. Hilltops have eyes, the spirits in them have eyes and ears. They overlook country. They can see what everyone is doing. And if you and your family are behaving well, you'll be rewarded. If you're behaving badly, you'll be punished by the spirits. Bilia was the second word, and that's their word for fresh water, but also for mother's milk. And in the same way that mother's milk nurtures a young baby and leads to a healthy adult, fresh water is just essential in life. And her comment was, look after cart, look after bilia, you'll do a pretty good job at looking after country. And it took me a microsecond to sort of work out, I thought I'd stumbled across a novel way of looking at really ancient landscapes and come up with OCBIL theory. And in fact, she's talking about exactly the same thing. That knowledge of the importance of these hilltops versus the lowlands has been in traditional Noongar culture for the best part of 65,000 years. So that's the sort of profound insights that's been possible to obtain by getting to know people well and respecting their culture. Next slide. So the mesic shift idea threw me. I was trying to think, what on earth are you guys talking about with the mesic shift? And of course, you've had the big floods, you know, in the northern rivers, and Sydney gets torrential rain and that sort of thing. And I thought, oh, yeah, of course. We all have to understand that there is a fundamentally different weather system, West Coast, East Coast. So whenever you're wet, we're going through drought. And whether you're in drought, we're getting average or above average rainfall. So this is a plot showing average rainfall from 1900 to 2020 in southwestern Australia. The red bars are drought years below average, and the blue bars are above average. And you can see the trend bleeding obvious since the 1960s, 1970s, far more drought years, and the blue bars have got smaller. So things have been drying out here. Our biggest challenge is dealing with not mesic shift, but drought shift or dry shift. So next slide. And that immediately raises fire, because as country dries out, places that traditionally might have been wetter may not have suffered so much from fire. You know, fire running into wet country will often stop. So one of my PhD students, Ursula Rodriguez, has just submitted her thesis. She spent 3 years with Noongar's northeast of Albany, trying to understand how they care for country and apply fire to it. On the left photo in this slide is a traditional burn. So the oldies were there, sitting around having a cup of tea, just 15 metres away from the traditional burn. There were kids running around barefoot, eating some of the barley grubs that came out of the wattles, and a great time was had by all. The country you can see is quite open. This is York gum woodland. A dugite, which is a poisonous snake, came right through the middle of the camp. You know, it was just a very convivial environment. And what it doesn't show is the care that the elders took in going around and saying, whatever we do, we don't kill the adult trees, keep fire right away from it, rake around them, rake a fire break around the little area we're going to burn, and that shrub, this shrub, that herb can't be burnt. And young rangers then went away and did the burning, with the elders starting it. On the right-hand side is a conventional prescribed burn by the Conservation Department here in Forest. It took out 10,000 hectares in one afternoon from aerial ignition. So poles apart in terms of how people perceive and use fire. Next slide. And we've been really interested in the wetter parts of the forest in particular, because they were 30, 40, 50 years ago, they were wet permanently, 12 months of the year, and therefore served as fire breaks, as Mark described. You know, that's the way it operated. Today, up to 6 months, they'll turn bone dry with this drying out of the southwest. And I've got just an example that has the Albany pitcher plant, Cephalotus, in it, of the rich flora that you find in the peat swamps. And the peat can be up to 1 to 2 metres deep, and it's usually in the more elevated bits of country, so it's old peats we're talking about. To form that amount of peat, the estimates are it takes 5 to 10,000 years. On the right-hand side is an escape prescribed burn that went through a peat swamp. You can see the original soil level there. That's a lignituba of Homilospermum firmum in the Myrtaceae. And the habitat of Cephalotus is just below the orange line. It just sits tucked in under the Homilospermum. In this case, 60 centimetres to a metre of peat has gone up in smoke. So the clock's been set back 5 to 10,000 years in this peat swamp. Next slide. So there's another Homilospermum skeleton, lignituba. There's an incinerated Cephalotus, and you know, it's the bottom photo isn't from outback Queensland. That's the cracking clay limestone. Peat on a swamp that's been hammered by fire. Next slide. Another place where there are refuges from fire are the the small pools on granite rock. The granite rock won't burn, of course. So you can see the richness of the aquatic flora. That's mostly native flora you're looking at in mammoths on granite. So they're also wet, isolated places in southern forests. Next slide. And here's Lynette in the York gum woodland instructing one of her sons about how to burn. So just to drive home again, you can see there's a little pile of stuff that's been scratched up away from the trees to make sure they didn't catch a light. Tiny little fire, cool burn. And next slide. Lynette has been a tremendous help. She's now got a doctorate, honorary doctorate, and co-supervises PhD students. So this is some of Ursula's data. And on the right-hand side, these wiggly lines, U-shaped, are a 2-kilometre walk where every metre, the plants were recorded in a metre by metre quadrat. And then Lynette was asked, is it okay at this time of year to burn that quadrat? And on the left-hand side, we divided the communities up into the vegetation communities under the letter A at the top there. Basically, granite mallee heath was the richest flora in terms of metre squared quadrats. And if you look at the time scale when it is appropriate to burn, for the green bars, and in fact for all the bars right across into York gum woodland, it's around April to May, near where the first opening rains fall, and you burn in the second rain after the first opening rains. First opening rains moistens up the litter. The second rain then gives you better control. And you can see the extremely narrow window here that applies. So basically, the place that's most vulnerable to fire is granite mallee heath, and that's classic OCBIL, that's upland stuff. But even the lowland stuff, the Oxyphleber woodland, which is a red line along the left-hand side there, also indicates that the best time if you want to care for the full diversity of culturally significant plants remains around April, May. Forget any other time of year. Next slide. So one of the big, the very first management hypothesis we have in OCBIL theory is on OCBILs, don't disturb them. And that's what the Aborigines say, primarily because in their culture they're full of spirits and the spirits will get angry. So, if you're going to put a walkway in, don't drill holes in the rock and elevate it. If you want to apply fire, don't burn the rock, burn the surrounding vegetation for sure. But even the margins are full of local endemics. So minimising human disturbance on OCBILs is the fundamental thing, and that's what Lynette's teaching her son here. It stands to reason that Aboriginal people have a reasonable idea of how to apply fire, and the final take-home message really is that it's precision fire applied to the landscape. And by precision, I mean down to the nearest square metre. If you're going to look after every tree, you've got to rake around every tree. If you've got local culturally important plants like the acacias that have party grubs, you've got to protect some of them from fire and burn some of them so that the cycle continues as Mark has indicated. So, and this is a global biodiversity hotspot. I'm not suggesting that this approach should be applied uniformly right across Australia, because every community has its own requirements, needs its own observations mustered over thousands of years, hopefully, and may still persist in Aboriginal people's heads if we just open up the dialogue and show real respect. And that's all I have for you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. What an eye-opener. And thank you for explaining it in very understandable language. Yeah, much appreciated. Now, we do have a few questions. If anybody has any questions, please place them into the chat. We have limited time. Now, obviously we've picked up from you that the reverence held by First Nations to the uplands means that there's definitely a significant difference in the cultural burning regimes between the lowlands and the uplands. So there was a question about if the heathy plants in the uplands or the mountaintops have a limited age, what is the natural disturbance that helps to renew them? Is it fire? Is it drought? What might that be?
Lots of things. Fire is
Yeah.
one, lightning strike, an obvious thing, but it would depend on the local circumstances. What were the culturally most important species to care for? And as I hope Ursula Rodriguez PhD demonstrated, you're literally in quantum vegetation looking at a couple of hundred species that co-occur. So it's challenging indeed, and highly sophisticated, and as I say, precision. So it might be that it needs a burn, you need the Banksia cones to open. Well, the way you do that is individual plant by plant. If you've got a fire sensitive species growing close or nearby that you don't want to see damaged by fire. Flooding also might be a situation in peats and things like that. Storm damage. There's a range of disturbances in Australian bush that you have to know about.
Okay, that leads to the other question, which is, would these disturbances be part of the toolkit, I guess, of a restoration practitioner if we wanted to facilitate natural regeneration in a site, perhaps where there are seed banks, whether it's in lowland or upland, rather than assuming planting is needed? Notwithstanding, we understand the planting would need to be from that highly diverse, local seed stock.
Certainly, I would encourage every bush regenerator to get to know the local elders and put that question to them. Would be my first suggestion. And if that opportunity doesn't exist, then the maximum of minimised disturbance on the high oldest parts of the landscape is the best we can surmise if we don't have the benefit of 65,000 years of Aboriginal practice.
Yeah. Look, in bush regen, we used to have a dictum minimal disturbance, and then we realised that it's more like optimal disturbance. It's more like the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where it's neither too excessive nor too little. So,
yeah, I think that's so we've worked with elders and taken them to a highland and then a creek line, so that an ockerel and a yodful just very close together, and it's very clear that the vast majority of time was spent in the lower parts of the landscape. Vast majority of applied fire was on the lowlands. Preparing country to attract macropods, that sort of stuff. Lots of that went on in lower down in the landscape, and the last thing the Noirs would do would go up on top of the granite hill and light that up, because it just wasn't practiced. And secret men's business was practiced up in those positions. Secret women's business, they're places to be regarded as cathedrals, as we would regard cathedrals. Who would light up St Paul's Cathedral or whatever? And no one in their right mind, but a more conducive place where we spend most of our time is usually a bit more fertile, more able to tolerate fire and other disturbances than high up.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That concludes our time, and it provides a bit of a link between your talk and that of the previous speaker. That in fact these sites are cathedral-like in terms of the sense of awe that we experience when we're in them, and the ancientness of them humbles humanity. Thank you so much, Stephen. So can we all thank Stephen with a virtual clap? I love these virtual claps. They're just excellent.
And thank you, Mark. Thank you to Mark too. It was a great talk, Mark. I think we've got a lot in common.